Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning in for our session this morning. My name is Hillary Sager. I'm the Destination Development Manager at Travel Oregon, and will be moderating the session this morning. Before we get started, a few housekeeping notes. Please take a moment to orient yourself on this platform you're tuning into the session from, as things may look a little different from what you're used to. Use the chat box to the right of the video player to say hi to your fellow session attendees, and feel free to introduce yourself now. We have held time at the end of this morning's session to answer questions from the audience. To ask a question to the panel to be answered during that time, click on the Questions tab below the video player and type in your question. There will be some presentation decks shared during today's session. You can put your video player into full screen mode to be able to read the slides more easily. And if you're not able to join us for the entire session, or love what is shared so much that you'd like to come back to reference it again or share with a colleague, a recording of the session will remain on this page on the Summit website for about a month, after which it will be archived more permanently on YouTube. Now on to the session. I think I speak for most when I say we all spent a lot of time outside this last year. Personally, the term dining al fresco has lost some of its appeal after one too many outdoor meals between the months of November and February. But the opportunity those chilly nights provided to safely spend time with friends and family and retain some sense of normalcy during a very long winter was motivation enough to bundle up and head out the door time and time again. I'm sure I was not alone in this experience, and our backyards or front stoops weren't the only outdoor spaces we were turning to for some sense of normalcy over the last 19 months. Oregon's natural spaces, from city parks to county campgrounds, state and federal forests, lakes, rivers, and all 363 miles of Oregon's public coastline, offered cooped up Oregonians, and some Washingtonians too, a place to go when so many places were still off limits. And go they did. After a period of closures we'll hear more about in a moment, Oregon's public lands, and especially those in close proximity to urban centers, reopened to an onslaught of pent-up demand for outdoor recreation from both lifelong outdoor recreators and a significant number of first-timers seeking a new hobby or outlet to replace one of the many pastimes that were no longer accessible. Complicating this flood of visitation to public lands were the restraints federal and local land management agencies were facing due to new COVID operating procedures and COVID-related cuts to budgets and staffing. The combination of staff shortages, closed facilities, high levels of visitation, and many first-time visitors created somewhat of a perfect storm. But I don't need to tell any of you this. Many of you lived it, either personally or professionally. We'd love to hear about the first time you noticed the effects of the pandemic on outdoor recreation areas. Please take a moment to share your experience in the chat now. While the pandemic presented immense challenges, and still does, to outdoor recreation areas, I would be remiss not to note that these challenges were born from a place of positivity. We are lucky to live in a place where outdoor recreation activities are so accessible and so remarkable that people developed deep emotional connections to our natural spaces and seek them out as a balm for their mental and spiritual health. And for some, the pandemic had created a unique set of circumstances that brought them to experience these things for the first time. And that all is really good. As Travel Oregon took a year hiatus from traditional inspirational marketing during the pandemic, we turned our sights to the important role we play as an educator and a source of information in the visitor communications space. We leaned into messaging around how to safely and responsibly navigate the state, including its outdoor places during the pandemic. And we leaned on our partners, like those on today's panel, to help us respond to the needs and sometimes sheer chaos they were seeing play out on the ground in the most impacted recreation areas. During this time, I personally became engaged in recreation management work in two ways that had not been part of my day job or even existed prior to COVID. The first was participating in biweekly recreation coordination meetings convened by the Oregon Office of Outdoor Recreation that brought together local, state, and federal agencies to share challenges related to COVID-19 and recreation. The composition of this specific convening did not exist prior to the pandemic and effectively created a brain trust to help Oregon's agencies sort through the new normal we found ourselves navigating each week. For Travel Oregon's purposes, these meetings provided invaluable insights into what messages needed to be reinforced through our platforms to help move visitor behavior in a positive direction. The second was through a new program developed by my team at Travel Oregon called Destination Ready. The program provided funding and technical assistance to projects aiding recovery from challenges brought on by COVID-19, wildfires, and other crises. Our hard-hit recreation areas received over a third of the $913,000 total funding awarded through this program. It's these kinds of new partnerships and communication strategies, evolutions to the role of tourism entities, and innovative funding mechanisms that I experienced firsthand over the last year and a half that leave me feeling ultimately optimistic about the future of outdoor recreation in Oregon. And I hope you'll feel the same after hearing from our panel this morning. I am thrilled to be joined on the virtual stage today by 3 members of Oregon's outdoor community, representing 3 of Oregon's most popular recreation regions and offering 3 distinct organizational perspectives on how COVID-19 presented the ultimate test for Oregon's high-use recreation areas. Paul Reilly joins us this morning from the Oregon coast, where he is a program coordinator for the Oregon Parks and Recreation Department. Serena Gordon is calling in today from Bend, where she works as the sustainability manager at VisitBend. And Renee Tkach joins us from the Columbia River Gorge, where she is a project manager for Friends of the Columbia Gorge and chair of the Columbia Gorge Tourism Alliance. Thanks to each of you for spending your morning with us. I'm really excited about our conversation. And at this time, I will turn it over to Paul to walk us through his experience navigating the pandemic on the beautiful Oregon coast. Take it away, Paul.
Thanks, Hillary. So I think I'd be a little remiss if I didn't just acknowledge the fact of how difficult the last couple of years have been for so many people around the world, for our agency, for our state. We've lost loved ones, we've lost freedoms. It's just been incredibly trying times. And so when I was thinking about this discussion, I really wanted it to be kind of the collective voice from the coast region as a whole, as opposed to just my perspective. And so what I did is I set up a series of meetings with about 21 park managers across the coast region, the district managers, the region manager, operations support manager, basically anyone that would sit down and kind of talk about how the last year went. And then did my best to kind of synthesize the collective response. And as I was putting this slide deck together, I was looking for a picture of all of us together, and it's the reality sunk in relatively quickly that that picture doesn't exist. And so that was another point that I really wanted to bring up, is that in this incredibly trying time with these extremely low resources, historically low resources, we're also trying to manage these high rec areas kind of in silos. So it's very difficult for us to meet, to get together. These virtual meetings that we've all learned to know and love have been a stopgap for what were previously in-person meetings. And there's some efficiencies there, but the reality is those meetings that happened after the meeting, the relationships that were built, the kind of creative brainstorming that occurred after hours, all of that's been gone. And so what I want to do is just start this talk or this conversation off with I want everyone to think a little bit about when COVID-19 infiltrated your work life for the first time. And as you do that, I'm going to tell you kind of my story when those two worlds kind of collided. And it was late February. I remember I was sitting in an RMDM meeting, a region manager, district manager meeting. Their COVID was on the agenda, but it wasn't like the agenda. And I got a phone call, and it was for my wife, which was abnormal because she knew I was in this meeting, and then immediately followed up with a text asking me to call home immediately. And I remember walking outside and calling, and she said my middle son, Silas, had a low-grade fever. And at the time, that was like the number one symptom for COVID. And I remember that sinking feeling that I felt, and I wasn't sure what to do next. I didn't know, do I start quarantining now? Like, am I possibly exposed? We didn't have a positive test. I didn't know what the procedure was. And as a matter of fact, we didn't have that procedure lined out yet. And so it was interesting. I mean, I called my HR business partner on the phone, and we had the conversation. But that was really the first time that those kind of worlds collided. And since then, it's been inseparable. I want to bring us back to those early days of the pandemic and just set the stage. And I chose some lighthearted examples. One of my favorites here on the left-hand side was the toilet paper shortage early on. And Newport, I'm about 10 miles away from Newport right now. In many ways, I consider it my hometown. And we had toilet paper shortage, and a number of people called 911, and we made the national news. And Newport Police Department was creative in some responses for solutions that people could have. And I'm sure everyone can remember the Tkach dancing nurses and doctors. We had a flyover from some jets of our office. And those are some lighthearted early examples. But the reality is there was also some extremely troubling videos. There was people screaming and being welded inside of buildings, incinerators, burning bodies, and fear was pervasive in many people's lives, myself included. So in early March, we developed our first agency COVID-19 framework, and it was a PowerPoint. There was probably more questions than answered, and it was a lot of if, then what. And then throughout the next month, what we saw is a steady stream of closures and cancellations. So partner organizations would get in touch with us, let us know that they were canceling this event. We would hear from the different venues were no longer open to the public. And then in early April, we made the decision, or the decision was made, that as an agency, we would close our doors for the first time in history. And this was all part of the 2 weeks to flatten the curve movement that was very popular early in the pandemic. And this particular graph was not designed for COVID-19. It was developed earlier, but instituted during those early days. And so with those closures, there was just a number of really large implications for the agency. And so we make this mental shift from espousing or trying to be the most welcoming state park agency in the nation to more of an enforcement role. So we shift from welcoming people in to trying to get people to stay out. And that was a really difficult mental shift for a number of my coworkers to make, myself included. We were also deemed essential workers early on. And so that was where we were being asked to clean restroom facilities, clean shower facilities, pick up people's trash at a time when we really didn't understand how COVID worked. There was a lot of talk about surface to surface transition, as well as aerosolized particles in the air. And there was a lot of fear about what that meant. And did we have the correct PPE and what we needed to make sure that we were safe and we didn't bring this virus home to our families? And then with the closures came massive budget shortfalls. And so a large chunk of our agency is funded through lottery dollars. And as those dollars fell off due to closures, we absorbed a lot of that. And the reality is we had over 500 seasonal employees that we didn't bring back, and a number of permanent employees that were laid off through this process as well. As we began to reopen, and so some of those day use closures were lifted, and the benefits of people getting out and recreating were talked about. And we saw a number of communities that didn't want the day use areas to be open. So they remember those maps of like the hotspots. So like in their eyes, we're inviting people from the hotspot areas into their rural communities that didn't have the resources, the hospital beds, the shelf stock to manage an influx of visitors. And we start to see people, these are different examples throughout the coast, taking it upon themselves to not want people invited into their areas. I had to get really creative with this sign here because there's some bad language on it. On the flip side of that, many people were stuck indoors and desperate to get outside and recreate, myself included. And I live in a relatively rural area. I have a nice yard, so I can go outside. But I talked to some of my best friends in more densely populated areas, and it was extremely difficult. They were stuck indoors, and so they wanted to get outside and recreate. So the flip side of that coin is we start to see a number of people that are kind of, there's too many people coming to some of our recreation sites at a time when resources are historically lows. And so what we learned through this process is there's really no one size fits all answer. What worked well on the North Coast didn't necessarily work well on the South Coast, and vice versa. And there was even kind of like minutia within the district, park by park, where some folks did want parks to be open and other folks didn't. And so there was no one size fits all answer. And so we had to be consistently inconsistent and be comfortable with that approach. We also learned that if we could share decision-making authority with our partners, that was a really great way to develop solutions. And then lastly, we learned that if we're going to share decision-making authority with our partners, that we have to know who our partners are. And how we did that is we formed comms channels. And so what I would encourage everyone to do, whether it's when you're thinking about who should be invited to the table, really being open to the who and who should be there. And like I was thinking of the analogy of like when you cast the net, make sure it's a broad net. And I think I want to step back from that. I think that the reality is like before you cast the net, tell people you're going to cast the net, and they might jump in themselves. And so just be really open to who should be at the table. Oftentimes, some of the people that we thought about last were added the most to that conversation. And so just being really open and available to who should be included in those communications was huge for our agency. Communicating early and often when possible was huge as well. The reality is there's times that by the time we got information and we tried to formulate a response and get that information out to our partners and staff and volunteers, the situation had changed. And so that's not always possible. And so the flip side of that coin is when you're waiting for information, having a lot of grace and understanding that it's things are changing so rapidly, even today. Consensus not being achievable was something that we had to get comfortable with. The decisions that we made, even with our partners, when we all sat around and had these discussions, they were going to make some people upset. And that was something we had to just be okay with. And then lastly, sharing was caring. So many, all of the agencies, all of the partner organizations, we just kind of, during those comms channels meetings and those discussions, we poured out the available resources that we had. And then we shared, we allowed those resources, we got creative and thought outside the box, and that just paid dividends for us and the visitor. And so from this process, what we hope to keep is we want to continue those communications. We've got those comms channels formed, whether it's good or bad, just continuing to use those comms channels, what is fantastic, and then continue those discussions. So as we sat down at the table and we started kind of talking about different scenarios, what we learned is in those discussions, we started to learn about implications that we hadn't thought about previously. And so it was really important to share that decision-making authority and really have those discussions and just continue to communicate. And then actually just continue sharing. I think it's just a good model that works well for everyone. And so if we can not recreate the wheel for every organization, every agency, we can continue to have those conversations and share the resources we have. It's a good thing that I would hope would move forward from COVID. And on that note, I'll close with this thought. These are great kind of principles for our agency. We've learned a lot through this process. I think they're good principles for our partner organizations to espouse as well. But the reality is like these are good principles at a time when it's more divided in our country than I've ever seen in my lifetime, that we as humans continue to do as well. Communicate, discuss the issues, and share whenever possible. So with that, thanks so much.
Thank you, Paul. That was great. And now I will turn things over to our tourism partner on today's panel, Serena, to share with us some of the ways VisitBend is navigating these challenges in Central Oregon.
Thank you, Hillary, and thank you, Paul. As Hillary said, my name is Serena Gordon. I work as the Sustainability Manager for VisitBend, and I came on board with VisitBend in February of this year. So my experience with VisitBend has been solely during the time of COVID. So I will come to this discussion with a little bit of a different approach than either Renee or Paul, who have worked in their roles both in the times pre-COVID and of course now as we face the pandemic. So my role as Sustainability Manager is a new position that was formulated by our Executive Director, Kevney, over a number of years and a number of discussions that he and I have had. But the timing in regards to my role in COVID is interesting, and I'll get into that. So for those of you who don't know who VisitBend is or the role that we play in the community, we are really dedicated to bringing visitors here, encouraging them to engage and connect with our culture, with our businesses, and with our recreational resources. We really want to be creative and thoughtful on how we present a visitor experience to our community. And we also think it's really important to be a sustainable destination marketing organization. And when we think about sustainability, too often we think solely about the environmental aspect, but we really look at sustainability in our role, the role that we play as three pieces. So we need to have economic sustainability, social sustainability, and environmental sustainability. And as in my role as sustainability manager, I need to balance all three of those pieces. But as Paul alluded to, and Hillary in her introduction, the pressure on our recreational resources and environmental resources as a result of COVID and more people recreating outside really rose to the top from a priority standpoint as I took on this role. And so as we have a commitment to each of our sustainability pillars, we at VisitBend believe it is really up to us to help protect the places that we recreate and the places that give us so much. And we really challenge our visitors to participate in recreation like they're planning to return, and ask them to give back. And we'll talk about how we can engage our visitors as we go through this conversation. So as Hillary alluded to with Travel Oregon, really halting traditional marketing that we have since our inception engaged in, we stopped doing that marketing, and the visitors still came. And in fact, they came in record numbers. And the timing of the creation of the Bend Sustainability Fund, which is my primary role right now within the organization, was serendipitous, but the Sustainability Fund was not a result of COVID. It was something that was already in process, but COVID really gave us this pause to focus on it and engage in it, and also an increased reason to develop the program. And so we really wanted to use this time to develop a program to reinvest our transient room tax into the tourist-related facilities that make Bend so unique. And in our location, our tourism-related facilities are our trails, are our rivers, are our outdoor spaces, are our downtown parks. But while we are investing in these tourism-related facilities, we also wanted to uphold our commitment to marketing with our hoteliers and other stakeholders. So we really wanted to be able to reinvest into the resources that we market while also continuing to have the resource to market once the COVID restrictions were lifted. So as we developed the Bend Sustainability Fund, which is a grant program, our primary role is to invest in projects that protect, steward, and create sustainable recreational resources and outdoor experiences in Bend's backyard. And we really look at this as we want to give back to the places that give us so much. And without those places, people who visit Bend and people who live Bend in Bend are not going to have nearly the experience that they have today. So how can we create a sustainable outdoor experience for the long term? So as we built the program, we also built a website, obviously, and you can look at that if you want to learn more at bensustainabilityfund.com. But we used this as a channel to educate our community, educate our visitors, and also educate the organizations that would be applying for funding through the Bend Sustainability Fund. And we reached out to a lot of organizations within the Bend community that we thought might have projects that would fit the funding criteria of our fund. And the funding criteria, there are 4 main funding criteria. So all the projects need to be shovel ready. They need to protect, steward, or create a tourism-related facility with an impactful life of greater than 10 years. The facility must have a substantial use by visitors. There needs to be a clear and measurable timeline within the next 12 months, and the project needs to have grassroots community support. And this funding criteria was obviously based on what we thought we wanted to invest in, but also the guardrails of a tourism-related facility and what transient room tax can be used for. And we really engaged the entire community. So obviously our organizational partners, the people that were applying for funding, the people and organizations that would be on the ground getting the work done. We also engaged the VisitBend staff. We created an advisory council of 14 members that represent all aspects of our community. And we engaged our local land managers from the Forest Service, from Parks and Rec, from the city, and also from BLM to make sure that the projects that were happening on land that they manage could be executed and that they were in support of. We also wanted to make sure that our stakeholders, were on board. So we were in constant communication with our city council and with Orla and with Travel Oregon and with a number of other organizations that all had a stake in this program. And we also asked our community to share their input. So people who live here who will also benefit from this Bend Sustainability Fund and the projects that we contribute to. So we engaged our community, and then at the end of the day, the VisitBend Board of Directors voted to approve the funding. There we go. So in October, we wrote checks to for 8 projects to 7 different organizations. And over the next 2 years, those organizations will receive $840,000 in total. So those projects included mountain bike trail project, summer hiking trails up at Mount Bachelor, a nature playground at the High Desert Museum, increased access for beginner skiers at our community Nordic ski area, Meisner. It included trailhead maintenance and trail rerouting out in the Badlands, which is east of town. We also were able to fund Trout Unlimited for 2 projects, one of which was at Multnomah Falls, which is by far the most visitor-used destination in Bend. We funded Parks and Rec for a world-class bike park project on the east side of town. And then the other Trout Unlimited project that we funded was an amazing off-leash dog area called Rimrock that also has access to the river that definitely needed some love. So as we look at these projects, there's a huge benefit to our visitors. It's a benefit to our locals, and our stakeholders and land managers were all in favor of putting money into these projects. So that is a really high-level explanation of what the fund is and how VisitBend pivoted during this time to reinvest in our outdoor recreation, which was being quote unquote loved to death, because that's the worst thing that could happen, right? We want to make sure that in 10, 20 years, the people who are visiting now can bring their children, bring their grandchildren, can come back and have a similar and wonderful experience. And the Bend Sustainability Fund is focused not only on building new things, but also creating sustainable infrastructure for the destinations and outdoor experiences that already exist, and also taking pressure off of places that are overloved and giving new safe experiences for our visitors.
Thanks, Serena. Really inspiring work happening Bend. And I knew we couldn't get through this panel without hearing that phrase at least once, loved to death. So now that we've heard it, we don't have to say it again. And at this time, I will invite Renee to share with us the work Friends of the Gorge and the Columbia Gorge Tourism Alliance have implemented over the last 10 years in the Gorge. So
thank you, Hillary. Thank you. And thank you, Serena and Paul. Those are hard acts to follow, but we're all in this together, not only through the pandemic, but in our state and region. Well, it's nice to see you all today. My name is Renee Cash, and I wear two hats today. I am the chair of the Columbia Gorge Tourism Alliance, a network that came together through a rural tourism studio over 5 years ago, thanks to Travel Oregon, that eventually turned into the Gorge Tourism Studio and eventually the Columbia Gorge Tourism Alliance. I also am the project manager for Gorge Towns to Trails at Friends of the Columbia Gorge, where we are land managers of 2 recreation sites in the Gorge, one called the Mosier Plateau, a very loved trail out here on the Oregon side, and one on the Washington side called the Lyle Cherry Orchard, another favorite of the East Gorge area. And as land managers, we were all scratching our heads also as what do we do when this pandemic hit, and how do we manage these lands in a safe manner for the communities that surround them. I'm going to really focus on the role that Columbia Gorge Tourism Alliance played during this particular panel. And our mission is to optimize the positive impacts of the visitor economy to enhance communities and protect the region. So this was very integral in how we moved forward in March of 2020. The Gorge was already being visited, as we can see in this picture. This is not during the pandemic. This was before the pandemic. And like many favorite spots in the Gorge, especially along the historic Columbia River Highway, we were already seeing congestion and people loving these places. Like their church. I mean, they're out here exploring and doing all the wonderful things outdoors of why most of us live here. But when the pandemic hit in March, things began to close, like Paul mentioned. We had our state parks closed, but before we had state parks closed, we had some hiccups in closures because counties were starting to respond on their own. And the first was actually on the Washington side, which does not reflect this sign. This is on the Oregon side. But Skamania County, one of the 6 counties in the Columbia River Gorge, decided to put up reader signs on the road saying all trails and parks closed, even though they weren't actually managing those public lands or in terms of the state parks and the Forest Service and federal lands. But in a reaction of protecting their communities and the people that lived in them, closure signs went up before any communication was made with any other land managers in the Gorge, which caused a big scramble of where do we go? How can they do this? How do we get communication out? What's closed? What's not closed? And this, actually, this photo is also taken before the pandemic. And this was Oneata Gorge before the crisis of the 2017 Eagle Creek fire. I wanted to show this because this has been going on for a while, and this isn't the only crisis that's hit the Columbia River Gorge in the last 5 years. The Eagle Creek fire caused closures also, which also caused that fractured communication in the Gorge. We are 13 communities in the Gorge, 6 counties, and 2 states that often don't know quite how to talk to each other or speak the same language. But through collaboration and really through the network that was formed through the Columbia Gorge Tourism Alliance, we were ready. We were ready for the 2017 Eagle Creek fire. And we had gotten a lot of practice on how to communicate and how do we speak the same language so that we're all in sync moving forward. We had no idea that in 2020, we were going to be prepared, we thought, for another crisis that was really going to test and challenge the communication and collaboration of the network that CGTA had formed. But we did it. We created a BiState Collaboration that actually built upon the Eagle Creek fire crisis. We had land managers, mayors, county commissioners, sheriffs, port, tourism agencies, governor offices. Also, what's missing from here were guides like Martin's Gorge Tours, Gray Line Tours. They were all at the table too. Everybody that was really participating in and acting with the public lands around them and the communities that were surrounded by these public lands. This BiState Collaboration started to formulate streamlined communication channels that we began to develop key messaging for the different phases that we thought we could see. We didn't have a crystal ball. And who knew that in 2021, we would still be developing communication tools of where we were at with key messaging for closures and openings. When we first started, the gorge was closed. That first trigger of Skamania County closing lands really was what brought us all together in an emergency sense, and that we need to get together and actually organize. How are we going to be one voice so that it's not confusing to visitors and or the locals that lived here? So these are the 4 messages that we developed very early on in the pandemic. I'm really proud when I look back at this and knowing that we knew that we likely were going to have to roll back and go back to closures at times potentially, and probably mix up all of these different key messages throughout this pandemic. We had already developed through the network before actually the Eagle Creek fires and of course the pandemic was the Ready, Set Gorge. This was an incredible resource that we developed really to address the congestion and safety issues we were already having out here with the different sites being really full of people and at times causing serious safety issues. So Ready, Set Gorge was well established. And so during the pandemic, it became a vital communication tools of an interactive map that showed what was open and what was closed in real time. That took a lot of coordination, which was our executive director at Columbia Gorge Tourism Alliance, Emily Reed, who was constantly taking in the information from all of the different land managers. That also included the Army Corps of Engineers lands. We also had, we had already created a Trailhead Ambassador program long before the pandemic, but it really strengthened during this time to be able to communicate once those trails were open. And some of the trails that weren't open, we had Trailhead Ambassadors at those sites explaining why they weren't open and where you could go to experience the same type of experience, but safely. We also began to implement reservation systems at 2 key sites. The first site was Dog Mountain, and this actually began way before, well, not way before, so a couple of years before the pandemic. That sounds like way before because years are a lot longer than they are normally. But the Dog Mountain was a great test for a reservation system for a place that is, well, it's very heavily used. It's a pilgrimage that most people want to make during that wildfire season. And the Forest Service worked with Skamania County and all of the partners of this network to really implement this permit system that was a success the first year and has continued to be a success. So it was taken across the river to Multnomah Falls. And this was an idea that came up during the pandemic with the partners of we've got to address the Multnomah Falls parking lot on the I-84. So that middle lot that's in the middle to address the safety issues that are happening on the I-84. If you're familiar or if you're not familiar, the exit for the Multnomah Falls I-84 parking lot is in the off the fast lane. So there were times where people were stacked up in the fast lane waiting to get into the parking. And thank goodness there were no horrific accidents, but we wanted to make sure that that wasn't going to happen. But the funding was a challenge for the Forest Service. And so unlikely partners all came together and some likely partners that worked together a lot. But one of the ones that I think was the biggest surprise during this time was the Columbia Area Transit. This is a transit system that covers the Columbia River Gorge. And they came to the table and said, we'll provide the funding to make the hires with ODOT's help to implement folks there to check permits and make sure that this system is working. And it was a huge success. It had its hiccups in the beginning, but it turned out to be a great success. Again, transit projects that have helped really help people flow and have a good experience in the gorge are two websites, or one of them is a website that is hosted by Columbia Gorge Tourism Alliance, and it's called Columbia Gorge Car Free. This was a way to help people get into the gorge without a car, using those systems that the Columbia Area Transit provides to get to 17 trails by bus. This is new this year, and it really has taken this network to bring it to life. And of course, the Columbia Gorge Express, which is a shuttle service and a bus service provided by the Columbia Area Transit that gets folks to Multnomah Falls and also gets folks to the different cities. So it starts in Gateway and it goes to Multnomah Falls and then Cascade Locks and Hood River and the Dalles now. So folks can get out, see sights, leave the car behind, and have your Ready, Set, Gorge map of how to get there. And this is one of my favorite quotes. I often come to it, especially during these collaborative processes. And I hope that you can take away with it and sympathize with. Definitely resonates with me. If I had an hour to solve a problem, I'd spend 55 minutes thinking about the problem and 5 minutes thinking about the solutions. And with that, I'll hand it back to Hillary.
Thank you so much, Renee. We're all going to join you here on screen. So now that we've heard a little bit from each of our three panelists, we're going to move into kind of a panel discussion. I'm actually going to go back to you first, Renee, while it's fresh in our minds. And I'm going to kick us off with a pretty meaty question about how we balance our goal of reducing congestion and the negative impacts on public lands while ensuring we still maintain easy access for all communities. In your presentation, Renee, you highlighted two tools being used in the gorge: reservation or permit systems, as well as transportation solutions. Both tactics help mitigate congestion in different ways, but I'm curious how these solutions impact new users. So could you tell us what tactics have been used in the gorge to overcome any potential barriers to engagement by new users who might not have access to the information for how to navigate and use these new systems?
Thank you, Hillary. Meaty question for sure. This is a conversation that has been really important. And, you know, transportation and public transportation is really one of those tools that creates equitable space and access. Not everyone has a car. And so having these transportation opportunities to get folks from Portland out into 17 different trails is a great concept. But how do you get the word out to them, and how do you make it feel welcoming, and how do you make it easy for folks? Because oftentimes, if you're in Portland, you're like, gosh, it'd be great to take a bus out and hike a trail. You're going to think, well, that's a little harder than I want to do today. So maybe I'll just do a trail at Forest Park instead. But what we found is that through the communications tools that you mentioned, Ready, Set, Gorge, one of them, and the Columbia Gorge Car Free site have been two tools that we have really been communicating out into the public. But one of the biggest tools that we're developing right now to really hit that equity and equitable access component of connecting the dots. How do we make it easy for people to get out here? How do we make it feel welcoming? The Columbia Area Transit is kicking off this month, actually, the sale of what's called a Gorge Pass. That Gorge Pass is $40 a year and gets you to those 17 trails, unlimited use of the Columbia Area Transit or the Gorge Express. And built within that is a fund called the Equity Fund. So a portion of the sales of these gorge passes will go towards providing helping celebrate organizations and connecting with organizations that are connecting to diverse communities, and helping those organizations connect those dots to how do you get out here to the gorge using public transportation. So not only are we part of the sales from the Gorge Pass are going towards these organizations to help with these efforts, but also we're providing free passes to these organizations to actually share with the different organizations, members and communities that they represent out here in the gorge.
Wow, that's a really awesome program. Thank you for sharing that. I guess it was a meaty question, but you are already all over it out there in the gorge. I shouldn't be surprised. So keeping on the theme of access, I'm now going to transition over to Paul. As we all kind of know and also heard today, sort of due to the allure of wide open beaches and also proximity to many urban centers, the Oregon coast was arguably the region hit hardest by high levels of visitation during the pandemic. And many of those visitors were first timers to the coast, which was really exciting and also presented its own set of challenges. I'm curious how you at OPRD worked with tourism partners like the Oregon Coast Visitors Association to navigate negative resident sentiment while also tackling visitor communications challenges like facility closures, staffing shortages, and kind of just educating folks who are new to the coast on how to visit, safely and respectfully.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. ACVA has been a fundamental partner for OPRD for years. And throughout the pandemic, we really saw a payoff. So ACVA has organized what they call the Strategic Advisory Group, and it's a number of different stakeholders that all get together around the table and decide on pertinent issues and messaging. And we, much like Renee was mentioning, we didn't know that we would be ahead of like pandemic messaging. We were just like kind of getting together and doing good work and deciding on messaging. But what we found is we had this system that was already the framework that was in place to allow for this messaging like once COVID came out. And so that was really kind of fundamental. One, to get safety messaging out, but two, to just ensure that we could disperse some of the recreation. So there were spots that were less densely used, but people just aren't aware of them. They're not as popular. And so ACVA has really been fundamental in helping us kind of highlight some of those underutilized areas while encouraging people to recreate responsibly on those kind of like, I'm going to say it, love to death areas. It's ACVA has just really has helped us with that messaging, and then all the stakeholders that are at the table, we all kind of come to a consensus. And there's minute details that flow from that as well, like things you just don't think about, like dog off leash in pictures that we've managed to mitigate. And really, it's paid dividends in the long run. Just again, it's like that those discussions, sitting around the table having those discussions, is really beneficial.
Awesome, thanks, Paul. And now to you, Serena. So you shared with us the projects that were funded by this year's Sustainability Fund and some details around the project criteria. So I'm curious, with so much to fund in this space, can you tell us more about how VisitBend is using data to influence your decision-making around how those Sustainability Fund dollars are spent?
Yeah, thank you, Hillary. That's a great question. And I think as all of us are looking at solutions, data plays a really important role in identifying places that require more of our attention. So one of the funding criteria of the Bend Sustainability Fund is that there is substantial use by visitors. And how do you define substantial? And while our funding decisions are really made with input from our advisory council, our land manager liaisons, our community, one of the guardrails for the use of tourism related facilities is substantial use by visitors. And so we use a platform called Buxton data, which is driven through cell phone use and movement to learn whether a trailhead or a project location fits that particular funding criteria. We also use data that's collected through other organizations like the Forest Service to learn more about visitor patterns and what areas are receiving a lot of human pressure and where we might create new facilities to alleviate some of that pressure on some of our most popular and most visited spots. We also are using data in town to see how people are using the river and how many people are floating. Our Bend Parks and Rec District has a river counter and actually recently reported that this year there were more floaters on the Deschutes River in their inner tubes and whatnot than ever before. And so as we look to the funding of 2022 projects, we will use that data to say, okay, we do need to invest in accessible river spots. We need to put in infrastructure to make sure that people are entering and exiting the river in a way that doesn't damage the riparian zone. So data is becoming more and more important, I think, for all of us as we make decisions on where we need to put our energy and our resources.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. And I think it is definitely the future. And especially as more and more areas kind of fall into that category of high use areas, it's like, how do we even prioritize our energy within all of those areas? So that's really interesting to learn about. So now I want to turn our sights a little bit to the future. So Paul, you mentioned in your presentation that sometimes the last partners you thought about proved to be sometimes the most valuable. Can you give us an example of an entity or organization that you maybe didn't consider a key partner before the pandemic, who you now can't imagine leaving out of state parks efforts to tackle these visitor management issues going forward?
Yeah, when I was thinking about this, and the reality is like I didn't want to leave anyone out, and so I think that the best answer for this question, from my perspective, is that it was the additive effect. And so by inviting more people to the conversation, you got a slightly different perspective. And so those slightly different perspectives, when you multiply them by a number of different people at the table, that can change the overall outcome. So that one individual partner may not have moved the dial enough to make a different decision, but when you add 10 new people to the table and they're all saying slightly or similar things but slightly different, that is enough to move the dial. And so I think it's that additive effect of that diversity of perspective that's really important, that it's not just one partner that's invited, it's the invitation to as many people as possible that want to be involved in the conversation that makes the difference.
Curious, Serena and Renee, did you experience anything similar during the last 19 months? Or did you have any surprise partners kind of creep out of the woodwork that you now can't imagine doing business without?
I will speak from someone who recreates often, but I have a very narrow view of what my recreation looks like. And as we dove into the needs of our community, really connecting with groups that personally, I didn't understand that type of recreation and that resource was very valuable to a different sector of our community. So to what Paul said, like, you really just don't want to leave anyone out. And as you open up that parachute, it's like, oh my gosh, there is so much out there that maybe is just like not even in your peripheral, which was very exciting to me as well.
Yeah, really good point.
I would build upon that too, Serena and Paul. It is true. I love the parachute metaphor. One of the things we did at Friends of the Columbia Gorge for our land, for our 2 recreation sites, was we decided to actually create a map that showed where on the trail it was impossible to distance 6 feet apart from each other. And so it was like a heat map of where it was safe, where you could get apart, and where it was basically impossible. Quite a few trails in the gorge. So that people could, before they put on the trail, they could see, do I really want to do this trail that's really all red, which is you can't separate. But part of that conversation was we expanded our reach to include in that conversation organizations like in Hood River, like it's called Next Door, and some of the Latino communities, to help us develop maps that weren't all words, and really more visual. And so it really started to build our relationships where we have not had those conversations of how to connect to the different communities of the gorge, especially the Latino communities, and how do they read signs? How do they feel safe on the trail? What information do they need? And that was a really exciting connection for us, and now it's just building even more and more into our work.
That's awesome to hear. Serena, taking it back to you now, you highlighted the interesting position that many tourism organizations found themselves in during the pandemic. So despite that period of pausing on all inspirational marketing, we still saw visitation increasing in many areas, including Bend. So how did VisitBend help those kind of traditional tourism partners like lodging properties and other businesses get on board with the pivot that took place during that time to focus your energy on away from traditional marketing and towards the creation of the new Bend Sustainability Fund? And then kind of a second part to that question, now that that's been done, do you think this pivot, that like a mindset shift has occurred within VisitBend or within the broader tourism community? And is marketing inherently in conflict with management programs like the Sustainability Fund, or can DMOs like VisitBend do it all?
Wow, that is a great question. And I think it's a great opportunity for me to better explain how we are continuing to uphold our commitment to traditional marketing as the COVID restrictions decrease, and we can do so. But one of the key elements in the creation of the Bend Sustainability Fund and bringing those traditional partners on board was looking at our community from not short term, but long term. So first, we made the commitment. We are not going to stop marketing. We have a budget that is increasing. We are using this money to create tourism-related facilities that bring people to town. And we are creating a sustainable resource that will continue to drive tourism and visitors for generations to come. So people come to Bend. Yes, we have great hotels. We have great restaurants. We have some music venues. But when you ask people, back to the data, why do people come here? 92% of visitors say they come for the outdoor recreation. So engaging our traditional partners in this conversation about why this is actually really, really good for your business in the long term was a key. And everyone was on board. When you ask someone at a hotel, where do they send their visitors? Everyone says our first three recommendations are Multnomah Falls, Multnomah Falls, and Multnomah Falls. The Bend Sustainability Fund just invested in the sustainable visitor experience at Multnomah Falls. That's a direct correlation to benefit them, in addition to the traditional marketing that we're already doing. And we feel, in regards to your question about like, can we do it all? I think there's a balance. We need to balance the value of tourism. We need to balance the need of our community. We need to balance the need of our natural environment. And I feel like the team at VisitBend has the skills and the bandwidth and the thoughtfulness to be effective and responsible marketers while also reinvesting into the assets that we are marketing. And so I think making that connection and helping people understand that it goes hand in hand and we have to do both is really important. I think the pause in traditional marketing as a result of COVID gave people a time and a chance to sit down and say, oh, yes, we are responding to challenges that face our community instead of quickly reacting and putting on Band-Aids. And through this process of being able to really focus attention on the Bend Sustainability Fund in this first year has only garnered more support. And so, yes, I think that this is a sustainable program that we only see growing year over year.
That's awesome. Great answer, Serena. That was a toughie. And back to you, Renee. So you've shared a little bit in your presentation about some of this isn't the Gorge's first crisis, using the Eagle Creek fire as an example. And I know a lot of these collaborative communication efforts really were maybe not entirely born out of those crises, but were really fueled by these different crises that the Gorge has gone through. And so I'm wondering if, kind of looking forward and into the future, do you feel like what exists right now is a sustainable model for collaborative communication in the long term, or does it feel like more of a crisis response model?
Great question. Well, I would first say that the network came together before crisis, right? As we were talking about, it really wasn't fueled by crisis. I say that with, maybe crisis is too strong of a word, but people were coming to the table before the Eagle Creek fire, and why we formed the network, because we wanted to start solving problems and addressing the congested areas, and how do we disperse congestion away from Multnomah Falls, the Tumalo Falls of the Gorge, right? Everyone goes, right? And some of the other sites, the historic highway. How do we get them to go to other places? The Gorge is bigger. And that's how we came together. And then, of course, the Eagle Creek tested the strength of that network, and the pandemic has really cemented those relationships moving forward. We have really learned that the Gorge is not an island. We are not, you can't be an island in the Gorge, I guess. It is kind of its own, I always call it Gorge Nation. It's, 2 states, but it's really seen as one region. But you think, oh, well, we're one region. We all talk to each other. Well, that river between us is a really big divide at times, because there's only 2 bridges that get across. But sustainable, yes, we're still meeting. We met every week during the early parts of the pandemic, and now we are down to twice a month. And really, also another crisis that always haunts us every year, that also brings us together every summer, is the threat of wildfires coming back. And so keeping that conversation of, we have to start planning now for next summer. And so that's really what keeps this communications rolling forward, and not just thinking about where we are right now. We have to think a year down the road, and how do we plan for that? And systems like we talked about, the Ready, Set Gorge, the Gorge Pass, the Columbia Area Transit, the reservation systems, those likely will, keep building upon themselves. These were all tests, and, it's not easy, but it's so worth it in the end. And yeah, I definitely think we are sustainable and growing and becoming stronger.
Awesome. Thank you, Renee. Before we open it up to some questions from the audience, so audience, this is your nudge to get some more questions into either the chat or the questions tab, and we'll address those at the end of our session. But before we go there, I wanted to allow each of you a moment to kind of step back and reflect, even though we've already done that quite a bit, but reflect on the last year and a half, and share with us one professional or personal moment that kind of permanently changed the way you do, view, or feel about your job. And I'm going to start with you, Paul.
Wow. So early on, when we were having layoffs, we were scrambling around, kind of trying to make decisions about who was going to carry what bucket of water. And those decisions, I mean, these were practically members of our family, folks we've worked with for years. And there was a lot of indecisiveness about what happens next, and no one knew. And throughout my professional career and life, most of the time, if you asked me what was happening in a year or 5 years, I could give you some semblance of an idea. And this was the first time that no longer could I predict what was going to happen next month, next year, 5 years from now. Still 2 years later, and we're still having those discussions. And so I think the moments surrounding the layoffs of our coworkers, family members in many cases, were really changed my perspective on my job and then how we relate and communicate and work together. And it's forced us. I mean, it was horrible, right? There's many folks gone. And at the same time, I watched the balance of our agency pull together in a way, and with just pure, just wanting to be servants and serve the members of the public, come together and figure out a way to get it done when we had resources where we honestly, there were sometimes where we don't know if we can do this. We don't even know what's going to happen. And so watching members of the community, our partner organizations, our volunteers, our staff, right across the board, everyone pulled together. It restored a lot of my faith in humanity, just seeing how we did that. And there were so many times where, I mean, like I've cried on Zoom to people in my agency and vice versa. Right. And just seeing that layer of humanness changed my overall kind of like work perspective, because we're all going through it. And like, even outside the pandemic, we were still all going through it, just in different ways. But now it's like brought it to the forefront. And so just remembering and really like giving credit to like the fact that there's so like each human has such a diverse set of circumstances is going on behind the scenes, and give it credit to that. And COVID's allowed us to do a little more of that, I think. And so it really changed my work perspective. I want to just like love on people more and appreciate them more when I have the chance to, so.
Thanks, Paul. Really beautifully said. Serena, let's go to you next.
Wow. Well said, Paul. As I mentioned in the introduction, I took on the role of sustainability manager with VisitBend during the time of COVID. And so I only have that space to work within. But to answer this question, I would say creating a grant fund that directly impacts our visitors and our local community within a direct marketing organization is such an honor. And I feel like this is a model that other communities, both in Bend and across the country, might be able to replicate. And if we can create a system that gives back to the things and the places that bring us so much enjoyment and bring us together and fill us up, like that is just an honor and a privilege. And to be given this platform to build something from scratch and then see it through has been just amazing. So I am really excited what we're doing here in Bend, but even more so, like how do we use what we've learned to help other communities do the same thing?
Great answer. And Renee?
Oh, wow. It's hard going last.
Sorry.
You're very eloquently, you speak, it touches my heart when I hear, these different personal experiences. I have, one of the things that I've learned over the last couple of years is through these, through a network, we're stronger together. And that also provides this just beautiful sense of connection, also that we're not alone. And we're all trying to really try and figure out how do we best move forward together. And one of the quotes that often floats through my head is the fail fast and fail often, and not being afraid of that. Because this is new territory for all of us. And I think through working together that those hiccups often will turn into these beautiful projects that you had no idea what it was going to bring to life. And so that's been something that I really is cemented in through this time together.
Thanks so much, Renee. And before we address, I see maybe one or two questions from the audience that we can answer. And I do want Renee to excuse you from the panel. Renee is leading a session that starts right after this one. Can you tell us the name of your session for folks who want to tune in?
Yeah, thanks for the pitch. I'm going to be moving on to the next panel called Connecting Communities Through Long Distance Trails. That'll be a great panel, and I hope you'll join me and my other presenters for that at 10:45.
Awesome. Well, thank you for joining us, Renee. Feel free to step away, and we'll answer some audience questions and then close out today's session. So I do have one question that came in for Serena. Serena, someone in the audience is asking if you can expand on the sustainability project that was funded at Multnomah Falls that addresses the high use overuse in that area. Just some more details on that specific project would be great.
Yeah, for sure. And that's a great question. I think this is the first step in a longer term sustainability solution. The Multnomah Falls area is so highly trafficked that in order to come up with a comprehensive solution, it's going to take the partnership of a lot of agencies and a lot of people. So that is on our radar. This is really the first step. And this particular project that's being funded is really to help people find the places that they should be going and to help them avoid the places they shouldn't be going. There are a lot of social trails and unsafe, both from a ecological riparian habitat situation and also like a human movement situation, a lot of unsafe social trails that bring people from the main trail down to the water. And so Trout Unlimited has a great track record of moving into places that have been heavily trafficked and a lot of social trails developed to create quote unquote guardrails, both actual fencing and also just strategies to help people avoid the places they shouldn't go. So this particular project is really just trying to get people to stay where they should be while still giving them access to the places and the spots along the river that they want to go.
Awesome. Thanks, Serena. And I actually have one more question for you, which is, I know you just announced the awards for this first round of Sustainability Fund grantees, but I'm curious when you anticipate that the next cycle will open.
That's a great question. So the grant application window will be July 1 through July 31st of 2022. In preparation for that, anyone who's interested in learning more about the program, please reach out to me. All of the projects that applied and were successfully awarded funding, we had conversations long before the application process window opened. So, yeah. And then those grants, the checks actually will be awarded October 1 of 2022.
Okay, good to know. And we look forward to seeing that program continue to evolve. So seeing no additional questions from the audience, I'll just assume that our thorough presentations and conversation answered all questions that anyone might have. And I just want to say thank you, Paul and Serena and Renee, who's no longer with us. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and experience and hopes for the future with us this morning. For the audience, I hope that this session has provided some takeaways that will kind of help guide all of us as part of the outdoor community in the future as we forge new partnerships and find new solutions to the many challenges we face in this space. So on that theme, be sure to tune in to this afternoon's plenary session, which is titled How Wildfires and Climate Change Are Influencing Recreation Patterns and What We Can Do. Some good takeaways from that session, I'm sure. And I think that's at 3:00 today. And then last thing I'll say before we close out today is please also take a moment to let us know what you thought of our session. A link to the feedback survey can be found in the session description, which is down below the video player you're watching right now. And it also, I think, is being placed in the chat. So we appreciate your feedback so we can improve summit programming in years to come. And with that, just a big thank you and enjoy the rest of your morning.
Thanks, Hillary.
Yeah, thanks everyone.